Hi guys, welcome back to True Crime and Tea with your host Lily, where we sit down, we look at true crime cases together and we unpick them through an academic lens. Today's case is quite interesting. I came across him in the Monster series for Ed Gein. So there was a character in one of the episodes that was quite alternative, quite different, but extraordinarily sick in the head, and his name was Richard Speck. Now, we're pouring a strong cup of tea for Richard Speck because he's a man that was responsible for a very well-known mass murder in the United States of America. Is it well known? I don't know, because I only really came across him in the series because I wanted to see if he was a real person, to be fair. And we're going to look at the homicides that he committed, we're going to look at how he was caught, and we're going to look at it through somewhat of a modern scholarship lens to see what we can make of this case. So grab your cup of tea or whatever beverage you decide to drink today, and we will keep it as careful and to the facts as possible. You know, we don't sensationalize over here. We try and be as objective as we can. Sometimes subjectivity creeps through because where there are cases like this, there's always going to be opinion. But for now, let's get into the story of Richard Speck. Speck's early life seemed to be filled with instability and brushes with the law. Many brushes with the law. Some have put together things that demonstrate a bit of a transient lifestyle. He had transient jobs, he abused alcohol and substances, and all of this escalated to the incident that happened in 1966. Speck was born in 1941 and he was the seventh of 8 children. Eight is a lot of children. Soon after he was born, the family moved to Monmouth, Illinois, and his father, he had been deeply attached to, which we don't usually see in these cases. We don't usually see a close attachment, a familial attachment to the father, but unfortunately the close relationship that Speck did have with his father came to quite an abrupt early end when Speck was only 6 years old, because his father ended up dying of a heart attack. And 3 years after his father died, in 1950, Speck's mother remarried and she moved with her husband and 2 of the children to Dallas. Now, she only moved with Speck and his younger sister. I couldn't find the reason as to why she left the other children. I'm making a bit of an assumption as they were older, maybe they were with other family members. Speck was only, at this point, he would have only been 9 years old, and his younger sister would have obviously been younger than him. However, I couldn't find the reason as to why she left the other 5 children, or the other 6 children. However, as we do find it in most of these cases, unlike the close relationship he had with his father, Speck had an awful relationship with his stepfather. He was frequently verbally and physically to the children, and he was often drunk. And because of the way that Speck's stepfather treated him and his sibling, his sister, this led to Speck developing really poor habits. He was a terrible student, he didn't do well in school, and he started drinking alcohol at a very young age. And this is where we kind of see the learned behavior. His father before this didn't appear to have these kind of traits, whereas his stepfather was an alcoholic, and maybe he was mirroring the negative behavior, who knows, or maybe he was using it as a coping mechanism. But he did start drinking at a very young age, and because of this, Speck ended up getting arrested for the first time at the age of 13 years old. It didn't say what the reason for the arrest was. I'm not going to make an assumption for what it was, but his first arrest was at 13. And then, after having a very poor academic career in school, he left high school at the age of 16. In 1962, Speck then married a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Malone, and They had a child who was their only child together. She was born a little while after they got married, and their marriage didn't last very long. It ended in 1966. In 1963, after a number of arrests, Speck was finally convicted with theft and check fraud, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, he was paroled after just spending 16 months in prison, so not even a year and a half in prison. And then in 1966, in order to avoid arrest again in Dallas, Speck moves back to Monmouth. So remember, he was originally from Monmouth. He moves back to Monmouth. While he was in Monmouth, he robbed and raped a 65-year-old woman, and he was thought to have also beaten another woman. It was never confirmed from what I could see in the case file, but he was suspected of also doing the same thing to another woman. After being questioned by the police about the 65-year-old woman, Speck then fled to Chicago, and while he was in Chicago, he stayed with his sister. Eventually, after however long, he ended up settling into a Skid Row hotel near the National Maritime Union hiring hall. I don't know what a Skid Row hiring hotel or a Skid Row hotel is. I'll put a description of it here. But while he was staying near this hiring hall, he actually applied to work as a merchant seaman. However, on the night of June the 13th, 1966, he gained entry into a townhouse near the hiring hall, which was shared by 9 female nursing students. He gained entry, and each of the women, he bound their hands and their feet with strips of bed sheets, and he unalived 8 of them by strangulation or a combination of both. One of the victims he also essayed. However, one of the women managed to escape because she hid underneath one of the beds, and after what I would assume would be an excruciating amount of time, she was there for hours after Speck had left the scene of the crime. She crawled out of a window the next morning and called for help. So she'd gone to a neighbour's home, and she'd gone in with them to call for help and let them know what had happened in the home the night before. The victims of this crime were Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Jo Shamale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Farris, Mary Ann Jordan, Merlita Gargulo, and Valentina Passion. Those were the women that he unalived. However, there was a survivor, and her name was Corazon Amoral, and she was the one that had hid under the bed. She was able to identify Speck later, and that critical identification is what then led to being able to bring him to justice. Richard Benjamin Speck was then arrested after being recognized by a distinctive tattoo that he had and a failed. Now, basically what happened was, after he had committed this crime, he, for some reason, decided that he wanted to unalive himself. He was unsuccessful. He was taken to the hospital, and the doctor that was attending to Richard Speck noticed a tattoo on Richard Speck that had been in the news, in the media, because obviously they're trying to identify him. That was one of the identifying factors that was used to kind of tell the public, this is what he looks like, he has this tattoo, yada yada yada. So because the doctor had seen this, and he obviously knew about the search, the manhunt that was going on for Richard Speck, he notified the authorities that obviously this person was in his care currently, having tried to unalive himself. And because of this, Richard Speck then got arrested. Now, while Speck was in prison, he gained notoriety for a number of things, a number of different behaviours that made headlines. This included things like contraband, problems with substances, and what reporters would state to be unusual displays. Basically, he kept small birds in his cell, and because of this, they then nicknamed him the Birdman in some accounts. So the way I came across Richard Speck, like I said, was through the Monster series. In the Monster series, there's an episode where we learn about Speck, and he supposedly says that he was inspired by Ed Gein, which I found sickening but interesting. And he was also interesting because he was kind of painted to be this flamboyant escort-like person in the prison, and you are introduced to him because he's basically giving sexual favors to another inmate in the prison, and he's made like somewhat of a business out of this in the Monster series. Hearing that he was kind of building a bit of a reputation for himself in the prison as being quite different, and a number of times he had been brought up because of contraband, because of substance abuse, I found the link between those things quite interesting. I didn't really like the way Ryan Murphy portrayed it. I think he praised Ed Gein way too much, and it was just a bit off. But yeah, that's how I came across Speck and why I found this case, why I looked into it a bit further. The key survivor in this case, Corazon Amorao, was the vital piece of the puzzle that they needed to be able to find and convict Richard Speck. And because of her evidence, and her testimony, it kind of anchored the case in court, as well as the eyewitness identification, the tattoo, and then behavior that led up to his arrest and his eventual conviction. All of those things kind of played a part in being able to put Speck behind bars. Speck's trial took place in 1967, and he was convicted of the crimes, the homicides, and originally sentenced to death. In 1972, however, a landmark decision meant that his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In prison, Speck continued to make headlines. He was forever in the tabloids. And in later years, video and press coverage portrayed him in ways that shocked the public. There were images and reports that complicated how people remembered both the crimes and the victims. One persistent theme is how the media focused on the perpetrator's antics in custody, sometimes overshadowing the victims' lives and the systemic failures that were eventually exposed by the case. And we see this because we're talking more about Speck over talking about who each of the nurses were and the impact that Corazon Amorao had on this case. Now, we always speak about the media, so I'm not going to focus too much on it today, because we know with a lot of these cases, the media sensationalizes these topics, these stories, and as usual, we see more of the perpetrator and less of the victims, more of the perpetrator, less of the crime, and how it's impacted the lives and the families of the victims. However, let's think about the social ecological model. So the family instability, the substance misuse, and criminal escalation. So initially it sounds like, or it was portrayed to be, that Richard Speck didn't have a tumultuous upbringing up until the age of 6. So it seems like everything was relatively normal for Speck. I mean, yes, he was the 7th of 8 children, but back in those days, they tended to have larger families, right? So up until the age of 6, there didn't really seem to be much turmoil stated in the upbringing of Richard Speck. However, when his father died, that would have impacted the family, not just emotionally, because he was emotionally attached to his father, but it would have also impacted the family socially, economically, because now they're relying on the mother to basically raise the family. And if you think of this is in the 40s, women didn't really work outside the home in those days. So it may have presented other challenges, hence to why she ended up remarrying someone that seemed to be the complete opposite or very, very different from Speck's father. Because of the introduction of the stepfather into this family dynamic, also given the fact that only 2 of the siblings went to live with the mother, the other 6 were elsewhere, that could have presented challenges within itself. The son coming along with the mother is somewhat of a did the stepfather need to kind of impose his dominance as the male figure in the home, because Speck's father was no longer around and he was a new man that had been introduced into their family dynamic. That presents some instability, because could there have been this tug of war when it came to who was really in charge in this family dynamic? Because they would have been used to getting instruction, getting support from their mother after their father's passing. Then you add in the substance misuse, the alcoholism into the picture. That then brings its own issues with it, because you've now got a negative father figure in the home for Richard. So not only has he got the trauma of losing his father, who he was very close to, he now has the trauma of dealing with another man in a very, very negative light. This man who substances and also verbally and physically abuses him and his sister. Now you've got that dynamic in the household. Didn't really seem like the mum did anything about the way that the stepfather handled the children. And because of this, we can kind of argue that this early adversity that's been presented in the home raises the risk quite substantially for what did become Richard Speck. Richard's kind of coping mechanism, if we can call it that, for having a poor home life and a poor school life was to also turn to alcohol. Because of his choice of turning to alcohol, he then gets involved in criminal activities. So he then gets involved in petty crime, in burglary and theft. And that then escalates. So we're not saying that the adversity made the violence inevitable, because we know many people that are raised in environments like this don't turn out to be Richard Speck. However, the risk that was presented because of the adversity in the household did escalate, and it did impact Richard, because he seemed to copy the negative behaviors that were presented from his father or his stepfather. And because of that impact on his life, we can see how the early childhood trauma and the early introduction of the substances and things like that did impact how he became this violent person in the end. Richard was very much the motivated offender. When you look at the incident in 1966, he was very opportunistic when it comes to the dorm setting, the shared home setting. He entered into their environment late at night. So you have the late night vulnerabilities. People are generally winding down. Some of the girls are already in bed. So there was already the opportunity presented there. He, under the cover of darkness, found the perfect place to attack on this day in 1966. There was also one single entry into the home, which meant if there's one single entry into the home, there's also one single way to get out of the home. So essentially, these women were trapped, hence why Corazon had to hide under the bed until the morning to make sure he had left. And she herself didn't even go out of the front door, the one entrance. She ended up having to climb out of a window and escape to a neighbour's home for help. Again, the opportunity that was presented, the late night vulnerabilities, the single entrance housing, and then they also had a lack of protective measures on that home. So then it wasn't really like an alarm system, or there wasn't something there that would have been able to notify and protect those women from Richard. Now, I couldn't really understand personally how he was able to systematically go to every single woman in that dorm and attack them. I'm making a bit of an assumption here because I couldn't see it in the case files, but he did tie them up and bound their hands and feet, and I'm going to assume that he gagged them somehow so they couldn't notify the other girls that this man was in the home. However, there must have been an alert somehow for Corazon to be able to hide underneath the bed away from him. So it was just a side note. It was very challenging to kind of accept that these women, all 8 of them, were one by one unalived by this man, and no one was able to kind of sound the alarm for the next woman that he went on to attack. However, because there was something that had happened in terms of an alert, Corazon was able to survive. And because of her eyewitness evidence, they were able to convict this man. And the power of the single survivor's testimony and the corroborating evidence says something about the strength of that woman. Not only has she been through such a traumatic event, 8 of her sisters, essentially. If there are nurses out there, you remember when you was doing your nursing training, because there were nursing students, you remember when you was doing your nursing training and there were a group of you, there was always a group of you, I'm speaking from experience, there was always a group of you together and they were your sisters for as long as your course took, right? These women lived together, they probably ate together, they probably went on campus and to their placement together. So she had the traumatic experience of witnessing 8 of her sisters unalived in the most horrific way by this one man. And there's also this thing where she could have felt some form of survivor's guilt. Everybody is gone but her. But the strength that she demonstrated in being able to sit on the stand and give testimony against him, whilst also being the person that could corroborate the evidence that was presented, plus, you know, the doctor coming and even giving up this man, because he didn't have to. Ethically, yes, he did, but he didn't really have to give up Richard. Oh yeah, there's a tattoo there, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. He could have just let it pass, but he didn't. And because of this, these 2 people's, the eyewitness testimony and the evidence, allowed the justice system to carry out justice. Now, just quickly talking about the media, because I don't want to focus on this, we've spoken about it before. We have regularly seen how sensational press coverage can distort the public's understanding of the case, how it can elevate the offender's notoriety, and it can overshadow the victim stories. In the case of Richard Speck, if you were someone that was around at that time, you would have seen all of this coverage about Richard, about his weird and wacky ways, about him being the Birdman, about the contraband and about the substance misuse. However, what happened to Corazon? Did anyone follow her story? What about the families of the victims? Nothing is said about the victims and their families. And sometimes this gets lost, I think, tremendously in translation, because we're always focusing on the perpetrator. Right now, we're focusing on the perpetrator because his story was slid into another story, the Ed Gein story. 2 stories about 2 evil people that we are focusing on, yet failing to recognize and know the stories of the marginalized victims. And that speaks volumes when it comes to how much coverage should these people be given when it comes to their crimes. Should the focus be on the victims, Or should the focus be on the perpetrator, or should they be given an equal platform? Sometimes we don't see much about the victims, probably because they don't want to be in the media. They don't want to be, the center of attention. They don't want to have that kind of attention focused on them. However, that desire to not want to be seen does also impact the stories that get created about them by the coverage that we see that's done from the view of the perpetrator. I think it's very important to recognize that there are many victims in these cases on both sides, on the perpetrator side and on the victim side. Essentially, Richard Speck's wife, who they divorced in 1966, didn't have many pleasant things to say about him when she herself was interviewed. So even her story, to a certain degree, has kind of been silenced. We don't really know much about her, but we do know that she spoke up against him when it came to her testimony about Richard Speck, looking at the behaviours. I guess the question is, when we do see the portrayals of these people in the media, how do we accept that information? Especially when you have things like the Monster series, making you try and see the sympathetic side of the criminal stories. I had someone say something interesting, actually. They said about Ryan Murphy that he portrays them in this way to give you the choice to decide whether you should be sympathetic towards them or not, and to kind of see how, like we've done, the upbringing and all the kind of nuances around that offender's story, how they impacted the outcome, which I thought was an interesting point. I still don't like the fact that he tries to make us feel I think he tries to make you feel sympathetic towards the criminal, but that's just my opinion. Taken together, the Richard Speck case is a lens on how an individual's pathology, situational opportunity, legal structures, and media culture interact. It's not a single case story. There are so many different stories in this one little story. You've got the media coverage and the little, instance we see him in Ryan Murphy's story. You've got Corazon Amaral's story, because without her, we would probably not know much about Richard Speck. We probably wouldn't know much about the case, and he may have been convicted, but it may be another one of those cases where they've kind of got to put the pieces of the puzzle together themselves through the investigation, and you don't really know all of the facts. So there are so many other little aspects that come out of the story, not just a single story. It's a whole system that is involved in this one case. When we tell these stories, and I know I attempt every week to look at them through an academic lens, we have choices. We can center the victims. We can interrogate the systems that failed them, and we've done that in a couple of the cases. We've done that in the Andrea Yates story, we've done that in the Hazana story, we've done that in the Susan Smith story, and we've definitely done it in the Victim of Sacramento story, where we look at the systems that have been put in place and how they potentially may have been responsible for what happened to some of these victims. But it also gives us space to resist the sensational details that do nothing but grant immortality to the offender. Richard Speck is dead. He died in 1991 of a heart attack. However, we are still telling his story, similarly to H.H. Holmes, similarly to Ed Gein. We still tell their story. However, we take out the sensationalization, because they don't deserve their stories to be sensationalized. They don't deserve to be given the many accolades that seem to come out of the crime talk when it comes to these offenders. Whereas we should be speaking more about the victims and more about the systems that failed them. But true crime is interesting, and we talk true crime. We are almost oversaturated at times when it comes to true crime. So though we try to not sensationalize the story, we do still grant immortality to the offenders because we will continue to tell the stories. Let's be frank. We continue to tell the stories, and we're going to continue to tell the stories. And I would say, as much as I attempt to do this also, if we do create content about these cases and cases like this, we should aim to educate. So always, even if we tell the whole story, it's nice. A couple of the creators that I watch on here, at the end, they always aim to educate and memorialize, not titillate. They always aim to end the story with, what have we learned from cases like this? Because as much as we do find these cases interesting, there's always an element of learning. I say always. A lot of the time there's an element of learning that can come out of these cases. So we have to try our best to educate and not just tell the story without thinking about the impact that these cases have had on society as a whole, but may also have on the systems that we ourselves may come into contact with on a regular or not so regular basis. And that's it for today, guys. Thanks for sitting with me with this somewhat difficult story. It was a quick one today, I think. Usually we're on here for, I feel like I'm recording for ages. However, if you like this deeper dive on the Richard Speck case, don't forget to subscribe, turn on that notification bell. I do post videos every Wednesday. Come back for the next episode of True Crime and Tea, where we unpack many different elements and academic lenses in terms of the cases, and sometimes we just tell the story with something to note at the end. And as always, guys, it was lovely to see you, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.